The Galactic Emergency Medical Station orbiting Kepler 442 billion was having what most civilized species would call a perfectly normal Tuesday. Which is to say, absolutely nothing interesting was happening. And that's exactly how Dr. Vex Thornblade preferred it. Thornblade was the kind of surgeon who made other surgeons weep with envy. 6 crystalline arms that moved with the precision of a Swiss chronometer, compound eyes that could spot a cellular irregularity from across the room, and an ego that had its own gravitational pull. He'd performed surgery on the Crown Prince of Andromeda, saved the life of the Galactic Trade Commissioner, and once removed a quantum tumor from a temporal anomaly without breaking a sweat. Well, technically he couldn't sweat, being made of living crystal and all, but you get the idea. The medical station hummed along with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, which was ironic considering most of the staff were actually well-oiled machines. Nurse Pip Whistlebottom, a jellyfish-like creature who floated around the station dispensing medication and nervous energy in equal measure, was organizing surgical instruments for the 3rd time that day when the emergency klaxon started wailing. Dr. Thornblade Pip's voice warbled through the comm system, sounding like an anxious dolphin with a head cold. "We have an incoming emergency. Human cargo freighter, massive structural damage, multiple casualties." Thornblade's crystalline features arranged themselves into what could generously be called a frown. Humans? Oh, for the love of the cosmic void. Can't we redirect them to the veterinary station on Proxima 7? Sir, they're critical. The nearest human medical facility is 6 parsecs away. And? Let them float there. I don't perform surgery on primitive meat sacks, Pip. I have standards. This was the thing about Dr. Vex Thornblade. He'd spent the last 2 centuries perfecting his surgical techniques on the galaxy's most sophisticated species. The Arcturians with their triple redundant organ systems, the vegans with their quantum-entangled nervous networks, the Polarians who existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Humans, in his professional opinion, were barely more complex than houseplants. Violent, stubborn houseplants that somehow managed to strap themselves to rockets and fling themselves across the galaxy. The station shuddered as the damaged freighter docked with all the grace of a drunk rhinoceros attempting ballet. Through the observation deck, Thornblade could see the wreckage, a human cargo vessel that looked like it had been used as a chew toy by a very large, very angry space kraken. "Doctor," Pip fluttered over, tentacles quivering with anxiety. "The human commander is requesting immediate surgical assistance. Massive internal trauma, multiple organ damage, potential spinal cord severing." "Then he'll die," Thornblade said, not looking up from his medical journals. "Natural selection at work. Perhaps his species will learn not to fly their rust buckets through asteroid fields." That's when the doors to the surgical bay burst open, and in walked the most ridiculous sight Thornblade had seen in his 200-year career. A human male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a tattered flight suit that was more blood than fabric, with what appeared to be a piece of metal the size of a dinner plate protruding from his chest. He was walking. Not limping, not stumbling, not being carried on a stretcher like any sensible critically injured being. Walking. "Hey there, Doc," the human said, his voice carrying the kind of casual confidence usually reserved for ordering coffee, not discussing life-threatening injuries. "Name's Tank Morrison. Heard you're the best surgeon this side of the Horsehead Nebula. Mind taking a look at this?" He gestured casually at the metal shard embedded in his torso like he was showing off a new tattoo. Thornblade's 6 arms froze mid-gesture. Pip Whistlebottom made a sound like a deflating balloon and promptly fainted, which for a jellyfish involved floating to the floor in a very undignified manner. "You're supposed to be dying," Thornblade said, stating what he considered an obvious fact. Tank looked down at his chest, where the metal was definitely not supposed to be, then back at the doctor. "Yeah, probably. But I figured I'd walk over here instead of waiting around for you to maybe, possibly, if you felt like it, save my life. Heard you were a bit of a prima donna about the whole thing." And that, ladies and gentlemen, was how Commander Jake "Tank" Morrison walked into the most exclusive surgical suite in the known galaxy and casually declared war on everything Dr. Vex Thornblade thought he knew about medicine. The surgical bay fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral parlors and tax audits. Tank Morrison stood there, bleeding on Thornblade's pristine crystalline floor, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had what most medical professionals would technically classify as a really bad day. "You cannot be serious," Thornblade finally managed, his compound eyes cycling through what Tank could only assume were various stages of disbelief. "You have a 17-centimeter piece of durasteel protruding from your thoracic cavity, and you walked here?" 17.5, Tank corrected, peering down at the offending metal. "I measured it on the way over. Figured you'd want to know for your notes." Several other members of the medical staff had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the spectacle like rubberneckers at a particularly interesting traffic accident. There was Dr. Ziltron, a 8-tentacled Andromedon whose specialty was neural surgery, and Chief Medical Officer Kree, who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet. "Sir," Crix clicked in the Universal Translator's interpretation of barely controlled panic, "perhaps we should sedate the patient and proceed with standard trauma protocols." Tank held up a hand that was notably steadier than anyone's had a right to be under the circumstances. "Hold up there, bug boy. Nobody's sedating anybody. I want to watch." This announcement caused what Tank would later describe as the most entertaining 30 seconds of synchronized alien freaking out he'd ever witnessed. Thornblade's crystalline features shifted through 17 different expressions of horror. Pip recovered from his faint just long enough to faint again, and Dr. Ziltron made a sound like a garbage disposal having an existential crisis. "Watch?" Thornblade repeated, as if the word had personally offended his ancestors. "Sure. I've never seen alien surgery before. Figured it might be educational." Tank settled himself onto the operating table with the casual ease of someone sitting down to watch a movie. "Plus, I want to make sure you don't screw anything up." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. If Dr. Vex Thornblade had been human, this would have been the moment where he turned purple with indignation. Being a crystalline life form, he instead shifted through several aggressive shades of amber. "Screw anything up?" Thornblade's voice carried the kind of outrage usually reserved for declarations of war. "I am the finest surgeon in 17 star systems. I have performed over 10,000 successful operations on beings whose physiological complexity makes your species look like animated pudding." "Animated pudding," Tank mused. "That's a new one. Usually we get compared to hairless apes or particularly violent fungi." He gestured at his chest wound again. "So you going to fix this, or should I find someone who actually knows what they're doing?" The gauntlet had been thrown, picked up, examined for quality, and thrown back with interest. Every medical professional in a 50-parsec radius knew about Dr. Thornblade's legendary pride. Challenging his surgical skills was like questioning a Vulcan's logic or asking a Klingon if they'd prefer a nice salad instead of that bloody steak. "Fine," Thornblade said, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded either brilliant surgery or spectacular malpractice. "But I work under standard protocols. Full anesthesia, complete sterile field, no conscious patients providing commentary." Tank shook his head, which caused a small shower of blood droplets to scatter across the operating table. "Nope. I stay awake or I find another doctor." "Your choice, Doc." "This is madness," Dr. Ziltron tentacled from the doorway. "No sentient being can remain conscious during major thoracic surgery. The pain alone would cause system shock." Tank turned to look at the collection of alien medical professionals with the kind of expression usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to particularly slow children. "You know, back on Earth we used to bite down on leather straps and drink whiskey for surgery. And that was on a Tuesday. This is practically a spa day." "That's barbaric," Pip whispered, having recovered enough from his latest fainting spell to hover nervously near the ceiling. "That's Tuesday," Tank corrected. You should see what we do on weekends. Thornblade found himself in the unprecedented position of having his professional authority challenged by what he'd previously considered a walking meat sack. It was like being lectured on quantum physics by a particularly articulate sandwich. But there was something in the human's eyes, something that suggested this wasn't bravado or stupidity. This was simply Tuesday for Commander Tank Morrison. "Your funeral," Thornblade muttered, beginning to arrange his surgical instruments with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested someone was about to regret their life choices. "Hopefully not," Tank replied cheerfully. "But if it is, make sure you get the good part on video. I want it uploaded to the Galactic net with dramatic music." If the Galactic Medical Review Board had been present for what followed, they would have immediately revoked Dr. Thornblade's license banned Tank Morrison from every medical facility in known space, and probably filed a formal complaint with the Department of Universal Standards for Reasonable Behavior. Fortunately for everyone involved, the Galactic Medical Review Board was having their annual convention on the pleasure planet of Risa, where the strongest thing they had to worry about was whether the tropical drinks came with little paper umbrellas. Tank had positioned himself on the operating table like he was settling in for a particularly interesting movie, propping himself up on his elbows to get a better view of the proceedings. The metal shard in his chest rose and fell with his breathing in a way that made every medical professional in the room want to hide behind something sturdy. "All right, Doc. Tank said conversationally. "Let's see what you've got. Fair warning, though, I've had surgery before. Appendix removal on Titan Station. Emergency spleen repair after a bar fight on Proxima Centauri. And that time I had to have a Rigelian parasite removed from my liver. That one was particularly entertaining." Thornblade activated his surgical field, 6 crystalline arms moving with fluid precision as various instruments materialized in his grasp. "I don't suppose any of these previous surgeries were performed by actual medical professionals." "Define actual medical professional," Tank replied thoughtfully. "The appendix thing was done by a retired veterinarian who specialized in Andromedan pack animals. Pretty sure the spleen repair was handled by someone who claimed to be a doctor but might have just been really good at guessing. And the parasite removal was definitely performed by a guy named Steve, who said he'd seen it done on the Holnet." Every alien in the room made their species equivalent of a horrified gasp. Pip Whistlebottom actually stopped floating and hit the floor with a wet splat. "You let someone named Steve perform surgery on you?" Dr. Ziltron asked, his tentacles writhing in what the Universal Translator interpreted as existential dread. "Steve was all right," Tank said defensively. "He had steady hands and only charged me half of what the real doctors wanted. Plus, he threw in a complimentary bottle of antiseptic." Thornblade began his initial assessment, his scanner revealing the extent of Tank's injuries in holographic detail. What he saw should have killed the human 3 times over. The metal shard had somehow managed to avoid every major organ artery through what could only be described as the most impossible luck in the known universe. "This is medically impossible," Thornblade muttered, adjusting his scanning parameters to make sure his equipment wasn't malfunctioning. "What's impossible?" Tank craned his neck to get a better look at the holographic display of his own internal organs. "Oh, that's pretty. Is that my liver? It's bigger than I expected. The trajectory of this metal should have severed your aorta, punctured your lung, and caused massive internal hemorrhaging. Instead, it's managed to thread itself between vital structures with surgical precision." Tank nodded sagely. "Yeah, I'm pretty lucky that way. You should have seen the time I fell into a quantum reactor on Kepler Station. Came out with a mild rash and the ability to see 17 minutes into the future. Wore off after a week, but it was useful for poker games." "That's not luck," Thornblade said, beginning the delicate process of metal extraction. "That's statistically impossible." "Steve always said I was too stubborn to die properly," Tank observed, watching with genuine interest as Thornblade's instruments began working around the embedded metal. "Nice technique, by the way. Very smooth." Steve used to shake a lot. Probably should have been concerned about that. The extraction was proceeding more smoothly than Thornblade had expected, which was itself unexpected. Human physiology, while primitive, was proving to be remarkably resilient. Where he expected tissue damage, he found healthy regeneration. Where he anticipated complications, he found straightforward solutions. Your cellular regeneration rate is approximately 3 times faster than our medical databases indicate for human physiology, Thornblade noted, his professional curiosity beginning to override his species' prejudice. Yeah, I heal fast, Tank agreed. Drives the medical insurance companies crazy. They keep trying to classify me as a non-human entity to avoid paying claims. By this point, a small crowd had gathered in the observation deck. Word had spread throughout the station about the human who was not only conscious during major surgery, but providing commentary like a sports announcer calling a particularly exciting game of zero-gravity tennis. Tell them about the time you arm wrestled a Klingon, someone called from the crowd. Tank's face lit up. Oh, that's a good one. So there I was on Deep Space Nine. And that's how Dr. Vex Thornblade found himself performing delicate thoracic surgery while his patient regaled the assembled crowd with increasingly improbable stories about human resilience, stubbornness, and what appeared to be a complete disregard for the basic laws of physics and common sense. Everything was going smoothly, which in Tank Morrison's experience was usually when things decided to go catastrophically wrong. He was just getting to the good part of his story about arm wrestling a Klingon when the surgical monitors started making sounds that even he recognized as not good. Well, that's new, Tank observed, watching his vital signs do what appeared to be an interpretive dance across the display screens. Thornblade's crystalline features shifted into what Tank was learning to recognize as the alien equivalent of, oh crap. All 6 of his arms were moving now, instruments flashing between them as he worked to identify the problem. Your blood chemistry is changing, Thornblade said, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that fooled absolutely nobody. Some kind of pathogenic contamination, possibly from the metal fragment. Pathogenic contamination, Tank repeated thoughtfully. That sounds bad. Is that bad? On a scale of stubbed toe to imminent death, where are we talking here? Imminent death, came the helpful response from Dr. Ziltron, who was monitoring the readings from the observation deck. The pathogen appears to be Rigelian in origin, highly toxic to carbon-based life forms. Tank nodded as if this was merely mildly inconvenient information, like being told the cafeteria was out of his favorite sandwich. Rigelian, huh? That explains a lot. I was on Rigel 7 about 3 months ago. Had some trouble with customs over a cargo manifest discrepancy. Trouble with customs? Pip squeaked from his position near the ceiling. Nothing major. Mate, just a small misunderstanding involving several tons of undeclared agricultural equipment, a high-speed chase through an asteroid field, and what the authorities insisted on calling armed robbery but which I prefer to think of as aggressive negotiations. The pathogen was spreading through Tank's system with the enthusiasm of a tourist discovering a new planet. His cellular regeneration, which had been impressively fast, was now struggling to keep up with the toxic damage. This is exactly why I don't operate on humans, Thornblade muttered, his reputation flashing before his compound eyes. Primitive species, primitive problems, primitive solutions that invariably result in. Hold up there, Doc, Tank interrupted, his voice still remarkably steady despite the fact that he was technically dying. Before you start planning my funeral, let me ask you something. You ever read any human medical journals? Thornblade paused, which was quite an achievement considering he was in the middle of what most medical professionals would classify as a really bad day. Human medical journals? Why would I read primitive medical? Because, Tank said, reaching into his flight suit pocket with one hand while keeping the other positioned so Thornblade could continue working. We might be primitive, but we're really, really good at not dying when we should. He pulled out a battered data pad. See, I've got this hobby. I collect medical journals from species that other people think are too primitive to bother with. This is not the time for recreational reading, Thornblade said through gritted crystalline teeth. Actually, this is exactly the time, Tank replied, scrolling through the data pad with one hand. Here. Emergency treatment of Rigelian pathogenic contamination in human subjects. Published in the Journal of Interspecies Emergency Medicine, Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief of Xenobiology at the Mars Medical Center. Every alien in the room went very, very quiet. According to this, Tank continued conversationally, the trick isn't to fight the pathogen. Human immune systems are too different from most galactic species. Instead, you hypercharge the human's immune response and let it burn out the contamination, along with a significant portion of the surrounding tissue. That would kill you, Thornblade stated with the certainty of someone who had spent 2 centuries learning what killed people. Probably, Tank agreed cheerfully. But probably is better than definitely, and according to Dr. Chen's research, humans have about a 67% survival rate with this treatment. Those are pretty good odds for someone who's currently dying. 67%, Dr. Ziltron repeated from the observation deck. Those are terrible odds. Tank turned his head to look at the collection of horrified alien medical professionals. You know what the survival rate is for untreated Rigelian pathogenic contamination in humans? The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. 0%. Tank answered his own question. So 67% is looking pretty good right about now. Thornblade found himself in the unprecedented position of having his patient explain experimental medical procedures to him while said patient was dying on his operating table. It was like being lectured on fine cuisine by the main course. The procedure would involve introducing a hypercharged immune stimulant directly into your cardiovascular system, Thornblade said slowly, reading over Tank's shoulder. The resulting immune response would be extremely painful, potentially fatal, and likely to cause permanent tissue damage, Tank finished. Yeah, I read the whole thing. Want to give it a try? And that was how Commander Tank Morrison became the first human to volunteer for an experimental medical procedure that had only been tested in computer simulations, while remaining conscious throughout the entire process. In front of an audience of alien medical professionals who were rapidly re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about human intelligence. What happened next would be debated in medical journals across 17 star systems for the next 3 decades. Dr. Thornblade would eventually publish a paper titled Impossible Patient Outcomes and the Redefinition of Medical Probability, which would win him the Galactic Medical Achievement Award and cause him to question everything he thought he knew about the universe. But at the time, all he knew was that he was about to attempt a medical procedure that existed only in theoretical research papers, made on a patient who was providing helpful suggestions while technically dying. Okay, Tank said, settling back on the operating table with the casual air of someone about to watch a particularly interesting movie. Few things before we start. First, when I start screaming, that's normal. Humans scream when things hurt. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Noted, Thornblade replied, preparing the immune stimulant with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. Second, if I start saying things that don't make sense, ignore me. Pain does weird things to human brains. I once spent 3 hours convinced I was a talking sandwich after a bar fight on Epsilon Eridani. Also noted. And third, Tank's expression became unusually serious. If this doesn't work, make sure my ship's logs get sent back to Earth. There's some stuff in there that Starfleet Command needs to know about Rigelian customs enforcement. The stimulant injection went into Tank's bloodstream like liquid fire. Within seconds, his immune system began responding with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for planetary defense systems repelling invasion fleets. Tank's reaction was immediate and educational. He began what could generously be called expressing his discomfort in a variety of languages, some of which Thornblade was fairly certain didn't exist in any known linguistic database. Is he speaking ancient Vulcan? Dr. Ziltron asked from the observation deck. I think that was Klingon, Pip whispered. Very creative Klingon. Tank's vital signs were doing things that medical monitoring equipment wasn't designed to display. His heart rate spiked to levels that should have caused cardiac arrest. His blood pressure readings looked like the financial reports of a failing corporation, and his brain activity resembled a particularly energetic lightning storm. This is not working, Thornblade announced, watching the displays with growing alarm. Give it time, Tank managed between what sounded like instructions for assembling furniture in a language composed entirely of curse words. Human immune systems are slow starters but fast finishers. And then something extraordinary happened. Tank's cellular regeneration, which had been struggling against the Rigelian pathogen, suddenly accelerated beyond anything in Thornblade's considerable experience. The contaminated tissue began breaking down and regenerating at a rate that defied every known law of biology. That's impossible, Thornblade stated, watching his instruments display readings that couldn't possibly be accurate. Yeah, Tank agreed, his voice steadying as the worst of the pain subsided. Humans are pretty good at impossible. It's kind of our thing. The pathogen levels in Tank's bloodstream were dropping at an exponential rate. His immune system had essentially declared total war on anything that wasn't supposed to be there and was winning with the kind of overwhelming victory usually associated with galactic superpowers crushing rebellious colonies. Within 20 minutes, Tank Morrison had gone from dying of exotic alien poisoning to sitting up on the operating table asking if anyone had seen his shirt. Your cellular regeneration rate is now approximately 15 times normal human parameters, Thornblade said, staring at his instruments as if they had personally betrayed him. Is that good or bad? Tank asked, examining the spot where the metal shard had been removed. The wound was already closing, leaving what looked like it would be a fairly minor scar. It's medically impossible, Thornblade repeated, which seemed to be his new favorite phrase. You keep using that word, Tank observed. I do not think it means what you think it means. The observation deck had filled with every medical professional on the station. Word was spreading through the galactic communication network about the human who had survived Rigelian pathogenic contamination through what could only be described as applied stubbornness and creative cursing. How do you feel? Dr. Ziltron asked, his tentacles quivering with scientific curiosity. Tank considered the question seriously. Pretty good, actually. Better than I felt this morning. That immune stimulant stuff is like coffee but for your entire circulatory system. Thornblade was running full diagnostic scans, trying to understand what had just happened in his surgical suite. The readings were consistent. Tank Morrison had not only survived a procedure that should have killed him, but he had emerged from it in better physical condition than when he'd started. I don't understand, Thornblade admitted, a phrase that hadn't crossed his crystalline lips in approximately 50 years. Tank swung his legs off the operating table and stood up, stretching like someone who had just woken up from a particularly good nap, rather than someone who had just undergone experimental alien surgery while conscious. That's the thing about humans, Doc, Tank said, grinning at the collection of stunned alien medical professionals. We're not complicated. We're just too stupid to know when we're supposed to die. 47 minutes after walking into the surgical suite with a piece of metal sticking out of his chest, Commander Tank Morrison was standing in the station's cafeteria, examining what the menu claimed was coffee but which bore a suspicious resemblance to motor oil mixed with regret. This is terrible, he announced to no one in particular. Behind him, Dr. Vex Thornblade was having what mental health professionals across the galaxy would recognize as a full-scale existential crisis. He sat at a table designed for beings with multiple appendages, staring at his surgical notes as if they might suddenly make sense. 200 years, he muttered to himself. 200 years of surgical excellence, and I get schooled by a walking meat sack who thinks experimental medical procedures are recreational activities. Tank turned around, still holding the questionable coffee. You say something, Doc. Thornblade looked up at the human who had just redefined everything he thought he knew about medicine, biology, and the fundamental nature of what was possible in the universe. How are you standing there drinking coffee? Well, the coffee's terrible, but I've had worse. There was this place on Altair 7 that served something they called coffee, but which I'm pretty sure was actually industrial solvent with caffeine added. That's not what I meant. Tank settled into a chair across from Thornblade, a maneuver that should have been impossible for someone who had undergone major surgery less than an hour ago. I know what you meant. You want to know how I'm not dead. The procedure you underwent should have killed you. The pathogen should have killed you. The metal fragment should have killed you. By all medical logic, you should have died at least 3 separate times in my surgical suite. Tank nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, probably. But here's the thing about humans, Doc. We don't really do medical logic. We do medical stubbornness. That's not how medicine works. Says who? Tank gestured around the cafeteria, where several alien medical professionals were still staring at him like he was a walking violation of natural law. You guys have all these rules about what's possible and what's not possible, what should work and what shouldn't work. Humans don't really have those rules. You have to have rules. Medicine is science. Sure, but science is just organized curiosity with better equipment. Tank took another sip of the terrible coffee and made a face. Humans have been surviving things that should kill us for thousands of years. We fall off cliffs and walk away. We get poisoned by plants and develop immunity. We get sick with diseases that should wipe out our entire species, and instead we get stronger. Thornblade's crystalline features arranged themselves into what might have been confusion. That's not how evolution works. Maybe not for your species, Tank agreed. But humans are basically the galactic equivalent of that one plant that grows in toxic waste and somehow turns it into fertilizer. Word of the miracle surgery was already spreading through the galactic communication network. Tank's medical readings were being analyzed by xenobiologists on 12 different worlds. The video footage of a conscious human undergoing major surgery while providing commentary was being downloaded faster than the station's servers could handle the traffic. Sir, Nurse Pip approached their table with the kind of nervous energy usually associated with small animals approaching apex predators. There are 17 research hospitals requesting tissue samples. Tell them no, Tank said without hesitation. There are also 43 medical schools wanting to study your case. Also no. No. And the Galactic Medical Review Board wants to conduct a full investigation into your physiological parameters. Tank looked at Thornblade. What do you think, Doc? Want to tell the Medical Review Board how you performed experimental surgery on a conscious patient using a procedure that existed only in theoretical research papers? Thornblade's compound eyes went through several rapid color changes that the Universal Translator interpreted as mild panic. Perhaps we could keep this between us. Thought so. Tank stood up, leaving the terrible coffee on the table. Well, this has been educational, but I've got a cargo run to finish. My ship should be repaired by now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card, placing it on the table in front of Thornblade. In case you ever want to learn more about human medical practices. We're always looking for good doctors. Thornblade picked up the card and read, Tank's Extreme Medical Tourism, for when regular medicine is too boring. This is your business? Side business, Tank corrected. Turns out there are a lot of species in the galaxy who are curious about human medical resilience. We offer supervised extreme medical experiences for beings who want to understand how humans survive impossible situations. That sounds incredibly dangerous. That's what makes it extreme, Tank replied cheerfully. Plus, we have a 93% customer satisfaction rate. What about the other 7%? Tank paused at the cafeteria exit. Well, extreme medical tourism isn't for everyone. But the ones who survive usually book repeat visits. As Tank left the medical station, Dr. Vex Thornblade sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at the business card and contemplating the possibility that everything he thought he knew about medicine was wrong. 3 hours later, he was discreetly downloading human medical journals. 2 days later, he attended his first seminar on human medical impossibility theory. 1 week later, he became the first non-human doctor to publish a paper in the Journal of Interspecies Emergency Medicine. And 6 months later, when the Crown Prince of Andromeda came to him with a supposedly incurable condition, Thornblade found himself asking the question that would revolutionize galactic medicine: what would a human do? The answer, as it turned out, was usually something medically impossible, completely illogical, and surprisingly effective. Humans, it seemed, were very good at being impossible. It was their specialty.